Hello, my friend. On today's episode, I am speaking with the Director of Performance at Cressey Sports Performance, Massachusetts. It's John O'Neill. You've heard Pete and I talk about him many times on this podcast, but he's here to speak for himself. We talk about his path to becoming a co-owner of Cressey Sports Performance, and we talk a little bit about their approach to program design at CSP. So if that sounds fun for you, keep on listening because it's a great conversation. Hello, fitness business nerds. What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. And today I'm so friggin' stoked to have the man, the myth, the legend on the podcast, John O'Neill, who is the co-owner and director of performance at Cressey Sports Performance. You've heard his name on this podcast many times, probably from mine and Pete's mouth. And now we get to actually have the man here himself to speak for himself. So welcome to the podcast, John. So glad to have you.
Michael, thanks for having me. You're building me up a little bit too much. I'm just a regular guy that's looking to help some people out here today.
You know what? That's the kind of humility I assumed you would lead with. So I needed to balance that out with really hyping you up. Well, here's the thing is that, I think I've heard your name a million times from Pete. We got to meet a little bit when you came to our Business of Unicorns podcast in Boston. And anyone who Pete speaks so highly of, I knew was going to be a rock star when I met you. And then you came to our retreat and really wowed our audience and our Unicorn Study members with your talk. And everything I hear about you is that you're just totally crushing it every day at CSP. And it went from being an employee to now being a co-owner of the business, which is a path that not many people take. So clearly, you're doing a lot right, my friend. So just thanks again for taking the time to have this conversation today.
Oh, Michael, I appreciate it. I'm happy to, answer any questions you have. I know you mentioned talking a little bit about the path going from employee to owner, and we can definitely dive into that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's start with first things first. You just want to tell people like what you started at Cressey doing, what your current job is, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I interned at CSP Florida, actually the first intern class at the Florida location almost 10 years ago. So actually 9 years ago right now in 2014. I got hired full-time in 2017 as a coach up here. And really from the beginning, my goal was not necessarily just to show up and coach for a year and then head out and try to find the next step. It was, I really enjoy the model here and I enjoyed coaching here. And I knew all right, I got to figure out a way to make this not just a stopgap job. I got to figure out a way to make this a career. And so while owner was not necessarily like the goal day one, week one, definitely becoming a leader internally in the facility was, and whether it's leading the staff, the interns, being kind of the main voice for the athletes, whatever it is, that was a goal of mine very early on here. And, I guess 4 or 5 years of doing that. I'm about 6 years in now. I guess the year 5 mark, transitioning into an ownership role. And in all reality, I guess the question I get asked the most on that front is like, oh, how has your job changed? How has this changed? And really the only change is I am a little more mindful of not just the gross revenue figure, yep. Right? You're a lot more in tune with, net profit and other factors and expenses that go in. And so being involved in those conversations has really been the only main change in the last year or so, but my actual day-to-day job has not changed that much throughout the, let's call it 6 years. The actual responsibility may have, but like showing up, coaching, programming, working with athletes, working with the staff, working with interns, all that stuff is very, very similar to what it was, 5 years ago.
Fantastic. I think that's a great overview. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, let's dive in because you're right. I think the first thing I would love to talk about is the path you took from being employee to now being a co-owner. Excuse me. And, and I think this is a story that we actually don't often hear of in the gym space. It's maybe, and even in any business, it's kind of a rare path to take. And you already started laying the groundwork for how you did it. And it was started with a mindset of like, I want to make this a damn career. Like, I'm not interested in just a job for a year or two. I want to really double down. So I'm going to focus on becoming a leader, a voice of the clients. And so just kind of walk me through what those initial kind of light bulb moments were for you that started that path to you becoming an owner.
Sure, that makes sense. So I don't know if there was 1 or 2 initial light bulbs. I'm very grateful for the background I've had in terms of it being a little bit all over the map. So I was a math major in college. I interned in professional baseball on the front office side. From the time I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a general manager of an MLB team. I still do. I just don't want to take the steps that it takes to get there. But in all reality, my job now is as close to that as you can get in the private sector. At least I feel like it is. And so this is not necessarily like a 1 year, like, oh, this is what I'm going to do over the next
Mhm.
year. It's kind of just the mindset I've had for I guess a couple decades now in terms of the stuff I wanted to do. I've just in terms of diverse background, like I was an editor of my college newspaper, so I have some writing skills, get the math side. The training route was more so just like, all right, this seems like a fun job. Let me see if I can make it into a career. And did that, after college. Was really grateful. I had two great internships, one at Rand Phones in Connecticut, which they exposed me to a lot of different things. And then obviously the Cressey one, which I mentioned, and then worked in the field at both Annex Sports Performance in New Jersey and Drive 495 in New York City. So by the time I got hired as a coach at CSP, I was not coming into it with like, oh, my background is I learned the Cressey system for 3 months and then I got hired. I felt like I had a lot of different skill sets and a more diverse background than maybe your average hire. Those 3 years in between interning and getting hired, in all reality, like I'm competitive, and I spent those 3 years thinking like, all right, how did I wanted to get hired out of my
Mhm.
internship. Why didn't I? And so I spent, and it wasn't like I didn't do a good job there. It was more like a timing, like a lot of different hires. I'm sure you guys have talked a lot about this, but it's
Yes.
timing and who, what's available and is it the right fit at that time. And so I spent those 3 years trying to learn as much as I can, kind of all over the map. So whether it's, on the sports performance side, on the fitness business side, on the general population, training for strength, speed, power, mobility, whatever it was. And so I felt like by the time I came into work here, that I could step into like a more veteran role, even though it was my first year
Sure.
here. We had some like staff transition at that time, which I'm sure Pete has talked a lot about on previous
Yes.
episodes. But I was looking at it as like, all right, I can step in and not be like entry level hire for the next 1 to 2 years. I can step in and within my first year here, really, I guess, validate the work I've put in over the previous 3 4 years, to step in and really not only use the stuff I've learned with athletes, but teach staff members, teach interns, and really develop it that way. And I look at the stuff on that end, and none of that was done as a like this is my route to ownership. It was more like this is my route towards making myself invaluable, but also putting out the best product. So I know a lot of coaches. There is this is human nature, but there is a desire to make things transactional. Like I did this, give me this. And in all reality, like I started working with the interns in depth at the time when I did because I looked at our setup and the flow of our gym, and we're 15,000 square feet, and we might have 30 athletes training at a time, and I can't coach 30 athletes at a time. But if I coach the interns how to coach the athletes better, I'm all of a sudden affecting a lot more people positively. So I kind of just grabbed the internship program unprompted as like, all right, hey, I'm going to get the interns up to speed on the way I want things
Mhm.
run. And that became something that, kind of led into this title, director of performance originally. And it was not intended to originally. It was mainly for the sake of, hey, I'm going to put out a better product if the coaches around me know what they're doing more or know the way I want things done a little better. And so that, a couple of years, I guess 4 years as the director of performance only. I guess I still have that title, but and then it transitioned to an ownership role. And around 20, so I got hired in 2017. I guess around 2020, 2019, 2020, around the time when Eric got hired in the Yankees role that he's still currently in. It was like, all right, like I'm doing well. I'm the director here. What is the next step? Is the next step for me pro ball as well? Is the next step, running my own space, which I have seen so many examples of in the field, and I knew that wasn't necessarily like the way I wanted to go, at least not at that
Mhm.
age. And I was like, all right, well, I'm essentially running this facility now with Eric. Eric in Florida a lot of the year, Eric with his Yankees commitments when he's in the Northeast, Pete on the business side. Like I'm overseeing the whole training side and having pretty candid conversations with mainly Pete, but also Eric about like, hey, like this is, if I'm going to be here long term, like what's the next step for me? Is there potential to get ownership stake here? Is there potential to keep my current role and just continue to make more and more money? an ownership stake became the obvious route that we should all take. And I say we should all, as a standpoint of like Pete and Eric, like having somebody on the floor invested on that side. I think hopefully for them has been invaluable. But I guess that's the 3 to 5 minute version of that answer. But hopefully I was able to answer your question a little
Yeah,
bit.
no, I really appreciate you going down memory lane and sharing all the details from each step of the journey. So it sounds like if I was going to highlight the things that you did really well that our listeners could learn from, one is that you really took initiative to both gather the skill set and like the mindset you needed to kind of keep pushing your career forward, right? That you really were the one driving that. The second thing is that it sounds like you really thought to kind of give value first. I love the way you said that, I didn't approach it from a transactional nature. I really thought about how can I just develop the best product possible, the best service possible, and make myself indispensable at this business. And I think that's a huge mindset that is hard because there's some people who do need, because of their lifestyle, their personal situation, they do need a kind of a tit for tat. If I'm going to work harder and I need to make more money, right? But it seems like you were in a place to say, you know what, I don't need to push for that yet. I can just add value for now, and maybe the money will come, and it has, I hope. And and then the third thing is, it sounds like you're really, really willing to kind of ask for what you want, right? That once you've been in the job director for a while, you're really to say, okay, well, what about equity, right? What about ownership? Can we talk about it? Those are kind of my highlights. Anything you would add to that as like lessons to take away?
Yeah, no, I mean that makes perfect sense. A lot of it's based off perspective, right? Like I listened to Mike Boyle and your podcast recently. I mean, Mike's been doing it for 40 years, and so um, I have a tough time, I guess, and maybe this is music to the owners that are listening ears. I have a tough time like grasping the mindset of a coach that's like a year in and is like, all right, what's in it for me now? My like the way I grew up, and my mom's been teaching for 53, 54 years at this point, and still doing pretty much the same job. My dad was in the workforce for 50 years, just retired a couple years ago, 50 plus years. And so I never really looked at it as like, all right, here's my calendar date at the 1 year mark. I better be getting this. At the 2 year mark, I better be getting this. It was more so like, how do you earn your way into doing that? And I still do. It's cool being on podcasts like this and I mentioned the name Mike Boyle, but all the other guys that you've had on, the other people that you've had on, are very, very accomplished in the field. But I think part of the reason they are very accomplished, and I can't speak for them, is they're not looking at it as like, all right, cool, I've made it. Like I've made it. This isn't, it's not an athletic career where you have your career and then you retire, at 32. And so it is very much like I go to work every day. Like today is a Monday. I'm trying to figure out what I can get the most out of today, how this sets up the rest of the week, how this sets up the month, and then eventually like the next season. We're very seasonal here. Yeah. So like right now we're working on setting up our fall to make sure that high school kids come back in either, equal or greater than numbers to previous years. But it is very much like a long-term angle in your mind. And part of having a long-term angle in your mind is like actually showing up and doing the best you can in micro moments, right? In day-to-day stuff.
I think it's,
and so that's been my mindset the whole time. And so it's cool that, to be recognized and have it work out like that. But in all reality, like my job is more stressful now than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago was easy. Show up and coach. Of course.
Well, I think it's that long-term mindset that really has made you kind of a really right fit for an owner position, because that's the mindset of owners, right? Owners are playing the long game, right? We're not in it for the paycheck. We're in it for the long-term value we're creating in the business. And the fact that you had that mindset pays off. And here's the thing is, I want to make sure our listeners hear this too. It's that not all long-term plays like that will pay off, right? This is a success story. Not all of them are, right? You could have the long-term view and not get that promotion, not get the owner status, but you did. Let me do this. Before we switch gears, I want to just ask one more question on this topic, which is for all of the owners listening right now who are always trying to find ways to engage their staff and create a sense of ownership amongst their team, to create employees like you who want to make themselves invaluable and build careers. What are the things that that Pete and Eric did, knowingly or unknowingly, that made it possible for you to have this path? So what I'm asking is, what advice do you have for the owners listening if they want to create employees that take a path like you did?
Sure, that makes sense. And Some of these are conscious and
Yes.
some are not, right? And so I think a lot of it was essentially like, all right, here are things that maybe Pete and Eric aren't doing, whether they're purposely not doing it or they are unaware. And when somebody starts doing it, not claiming it and being like, oh, well, now I have to take it, right?
Mhm.
And so even just the model, the way we're set up here is, it's individualized programming, and that the worst part about the individualized program model is somebody's got to write the
Yeah.
programs, right? Which is going to take time. But just the nature of the size, the scope, the scale of our business, Eric can't write all the programs. So even just having somebody else write a lot of them, or write for this population or this population, and just getting out of the way and kind of guiding, I think is very valuable. I think a lot of times, just talking to friends of mine in the field and people I know in the field, it's the owners who kind of prevent their employees from having the chance to do stuff like
Yes.
this are the ones that are micromanaging the little things,
Yes.
right? And it's almost like I use the baseball GM analogy, but the GM of the team doesn't care what the double A team, what hotel the double A team is staying in, right? Like somebody else is worrying about that. There's people have lanes and stuff that they manage, and the owner's job is more so to set boundaries or guidelines. Like the term that sticks in my head is the idea of like autonomy within bounds, and you might be able to tell me where that quote's from. I don't know, I can't remember where I
I don't
read
know the
that.
specific
But
combination, but it sounds a little bit like self-determination theory oriented, but yeah.
yeah, it's kind of like, hey, here's the general style of how we do things. The level of professionalism we have, the way what we value in programming. But then the small choices, hey, you go make those yourself.
Yeah.
And I think I look at both the interns and the staff members that have come through here. Several of which are working in, whether it's professional sports, college sports, running their own facility, or doing something more entrepreneurial. From day one of the internship, they're given some autonomy within what they do. It's like, hey, this is what you're supposed to do. Here are the
Yeah.
guardrails, and the guardrails start really small and close to each other when you're new, and they expand over time. If you do really well within your guardrails grow.
Sure.
And if something is going wrong within there, then that becomes a conversation. But for the most part, I think our model tends to help create good, or help create productive coaches, because you have some freedom of what you're doing within the bounds we're talking
Yeah,
about.
I think it's a great way of looking at it. I think it's great advice for our listeners who are owners. Is right. You need to give people a little room to grow, right? A little autonomy for them to fill in the gaps as they see them. And I think a big part of this for owners, I'll add this part, which is for owners to be able to give you as an employee space to grow. They need to let go of some shit. They need to
Yeah.
delegate, let other people take some things on, and sometimes that's hard for owners, especially the ones who've been doing it themselves for a really long time, those single owner operators. To let go of a single task might really be a Herculean task. And so the fact that
Yeah, and
were able, and that Eric and Pete, for the most part, were willing to let you take things on and get things off their plates, and you were happy to do so, is a really great example of what that can look like when it goes well.
yeah, and I have talked about this before, but like I think it's a really valuable thing to do for whether it's you're an employee or an owner. Like you literally write down, right, keep a list of here's everything. It's standard operating procedures,
Mhm.
right? It's you write down a list of everything that happens in the facility, like who takes the trash out to who pays the bills, right? From a bottom to top approach. And if there's stuff in there that someone else can do just as good a job
Yeah.
at, like have them do it, because to them that becomes important, right? So the example here for us now is like, I don't do a whole lot of like 13 to 16-year-old evals anymore, which sounds funny, but like, cause that's a high percentage of our business, but the evaluation for those kids is not super
Yep.
complex. Like the complex thing is actually getting them to show up 3+ times a week. And having them make sure they sleep 8 hours and eat breakfast. So, I'll take on most of the evals I do are, college, pro, adults, people that, hey, maybe the eval is a little more
Hmm.
nuanced. But in all reality, like the new hires get the 13, 14, 15
Yeah.
year olds. And it's not to say they're less important. They're a higher percentage of our business than any of those other populations I talked about. But the evaluation itself is not the complex
Yeah.
part there. And
Well
so
said.
like that is something that is in our model is very easy to pass
Yeah,
off.
well said. I think those are great examples of ways that owners can kind of make space for people to take things on that grow their responsibility, grow their skill set, grow their experience, which is fantastic. Let's just pivot a little bit. I want to spend just a few minutes. I know we're going to go over time a little bit. Are you okay on time? Yeah,
Yeah,
I just
all
want to spend
good.
maybe
Yep.
another, maybe just 5 quick minutes talking a little bit about programming at CSP, because I think my listeners would kill
Sure.
me if I didn't talk about programming a little bit with the director of performance at CSP. Can you just maybe in the briefest way possible explain like what your approach is to programming at CSP? Because then what I really want to talk a little bit about is any tips you have for listeners for saving time on programming, because I know it's one of the biggest
Sure.
complaints we have. But first, just maybe explain how you do things from a programming perspective.
Yeah, and so obviously, said 5 minutes. I think I kind of combine those
Great.
answers, and so people hear individualized model, and they think like, oh my god, like everybody's just like special, whatever you want to say. Everyone's like this,
Special snowflake.
this
Yeah.
exactly. Snowflake's a good word. Yeah, where it's like, all right, you start from scratch every time, and the reality is like you're never starting from scratch, right? If you're starting from scratch, that means like all of the education that you did, everything you read, everything you look into programming wise, just went to waste because each person you got to restart
Yep.
that, right?
Exactly.
And so um, the big thing is like to me, like I got this actually from Charlie Weingroff, this exact term, which I think I got from Mike Ranfone through Charlie Weingroff. So I'll just to give credit where it's due, but this idea of like starting at the finish. So when people come to you and say like, all right, this is what I want to do, this is my goal, et cetera, try to get as much clarity of what they want as possible. Sometimes, I mean, kids are the worst ones in terms of they don't necessarily
Sure.
know, but like, all right, they're coming to you for this sport. Here are the key competencies that make someone good at this sport. For us, it's a lot of baseball, but we see some football, basketball, lacrosse as well, just to name a few, and some others. But start at the finish and backtrack from there. So whatever they need to do in their sport, if you have 1 month with them and it's, you only have 2 days a week, well, what your training should look kind of similar to what they need to do in their sport. If you have 6 months and 4 days a week with them, well, you have some time to maybe undo or redo some stuff. And so it's always just starting to finish, looking at this idea of like, what is the gold standard in their sport? And so, if you need to be, this size or have this speed, you have to retrace it
Yeah.
towards that, right? Or throw this hard or run this
Can I
fast.
interject just a quick question, John? So if you say
Yeah,
that you're not starting from scratch with each individualized program, which makes perfect sense, does
sure.
that mean you're using templates? And if so, can you just describe a little bit about how you think about templatizing some of your programs?
Yeah, yeah. So the biggest variable is frequency, right? So your 2 day, your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, however many days a week you're seeing people, and our model is awesome, and I can say it that way because I didn't create it, but our model is awesome in that like we see more than 50% of the people we see train in our unlimited package, which is 3 or more days a week, right? It's actually pushes 75% in parts of the year, and so those are people 3, 4, 5 days a week, and so you see those people all the time, and so you don't like if it, you don't have to overthink every little slot in the program because you're going to see them all the time. When you have somebody 1 or 2 days a week, I think the program in a weird way becomes more
Mm.
complex because you better make sure you nail that one day a week to get that person to want to come back, right? And so if you're seeing someone 1 or 2 days a week, the goal for me is usually how do I figure out a way to increase their
Hmm.
frequency. When I'm seeing someone 3, 4, 5 days a week, the goal is like, all right, what are the things that they can see tangible progress on that make them want to keep coming back, that make them say, hey, I got like this happened, I'm hitting the ball harder than I ever have off of that program. And here's maybe why that happened, or here's things that went well that correlated to that. But yeah, everything starts with frequency and then it's demographic from there. So let's say I'll use the 3 day a week. And so maybe it's all full body, maybe it's one full, one upper, one lower. That doesn't really matter too much. The delineation of that one is more so like, are they training back to back days or not? But whatever version of that you choose, you have to pick a demographic where it makes sense. So your 13-year-old 3 days a week and your 19-year-old 3 days a week should look a little bit
Sure.
different, right? And then from there, like the exercise categories don't change that much, and so like we deal with a lot of athletes, right? So everybody's going to have some kind of sprinting, right? if it's a field sport athlete who maybe it's a midfielder in lacrosse, they're probably going to have more sprinting than a catcher in baseball, right? Just to give, or a pitcher in baseball to take it more extreme. And so like the amounts of stuff might change, but the stuff itself doesn't change that much. And what I mean by that is like, all right, your 19-year-old might be doing a SSB reverse lunge, and your 15-year-old is doing a dumbbell goblet reverse lunge, right? And so just knowing like here are the levels of exercises, here's the amounts that are appropriate, based off demographic, based off training age. There's a number of factors you could use to individualize, but like frequency, demographic, training age, and then like timeline, like how much time you actually have with them. Those are the big rocks. I mean, I think like I love talking programming. I'm sure you could tell like the keep it under 5 minutes is gonna be hard, but um, the uh, the reality is like I think it's a lot. I think it's almost overvalued in a
Hmm.
way, because sometimes the people who are so concerned with programming are missing the boat. That hey, just establish training frequency and motivation. Like we see people like if we see someone 4 days a week, we're seeing them what 5 to 6 hours. We were running like 75 to 90 minute sessions, 6 hours in a week out of what's the math here? 150 plus. I think it's
Yep.
168. That's in my head. I think it's 168. Like there's a lot of time that you want training to be enjoyable enough and them to be into enough that it's influencing everything
Yeah.
else. That's where the magic happens in terms of like, all right, this person really liked training so much that they went and slept 8 hours, that they had made good nutritional choices, and all of a sudden it snowballs because they start seeing better training results. But sometimes it starts with them liking the training. That's like this idea of like having like this keystone or foundational habit. For a lot of people, it is training, and everything else snowballs
Yeah.
off of that.
Let me
So
ask.
whatever your programming is, yeah, whatever your programming is, it should be motivating people to do the rest of things that are going to impact training outside of
Yeah.
training, to do those well.
It makes sense. Let me one last question on programming because I think you've spelled out I think a lot of
Yeah.
best practices for our listeners, which is super helpful. And I love the way you organized and think about organizing your templates. I think a lot of our listeners struggle to find the right approach to that.
Yeah.
But one of the things that one of the ways we think about programming at MFF is that programming has to happen in the feedback loop with the clients, right? That we make
Yeah.
our best effort based on their assessments, what we learned about them to put out the best programming, but that at some point we need to be listening to them, getting feedback from them about what's motivating, what's not, what they like, what they don't like, what's hard, and clearly with so many people on the floor at the time, you can't be the one who's hearing firsthand that feedback for every client. So how do you get the information you need about the client's experience to keep the programs good, if not improving? So how do you get the feedback from the clients at CSP?
Sure. That's a good question. I mean, so we see between 300 and 400 different people within a calendar year. It's not at one time. We get a lot of people who are here for 3 months, 6 months in some scenarios, et cetera, just because of the seasonal nature of sports. But I try to have some relationship with all of them. And now some relationship might be as little as I say hi and bye to them, and we talk for a minute, and just given our schedules or whatnot, maybe they're once a week in a day where I'm like not on the floor as much. Maybe I talk to them an hour 3 days a week. It's hard to quantify what that means. But in all reality, the hardest ones, like you said, are the ones who I barely see. And those are ones who one of two things happen. So I either pass that program off to another staff member who sees them more
Mm-hmm.
frequently, and it's like, hey, have you been talking to, I'll use your name just so I don't pick on random athlete, but have you been talking to, Michael Keeler recently? I haven't seen him train in a couple weeks. All right, cool. Maybe you're a better fit to write that
Sure.
program then. That's one. The second one, because sometimes clients don't like when their programs get passed around. That's a real thing, and I don't blame them. Like there's some comfort in consistency and in knowing like, all right, this is this is who writes them and whatnot. That's someone who I'll just ask people, hey, how did they look on X exercise? How did they look on this? It's not the best way to do it. In all reality, I'd rather pass that program off to someone who is seeing them. But hey, what did they really like? What did they really hate? Those are all like good questions. And the conversation might only be like a minute, and it might be with one of our
Sure.
interns who winds up talking to them a lot. Like, hey, what they really like in training? How are they doing on this? What they dislike? And the whole like dislike thing. Like I think in the sports performance world, there is like this desire to make things like so scientific and so like this is the perfect progression. When all reality, like if you pick things that people like, as long as it's like within bounds, like they're going to train harder at it. So if you have your perfect exercise and you can come one step removed from it or just one lateral move from it to something they really are into, cool, let's do that. That's going to get them to train harder, train more frequently, et cetera. So, but yeah, like to answer your question, it's either the program gets passed off or I try to talk to somebody on staff. But I would say, of the 100 to 150 people I program for in a year, and I don't know that exact number, but let's say it's 150, right? I don't know totally sure. I have pretty good conversations and good relationship with 100 plus of them. Like probably 3 out of every 4 that I program for, like I know pretty well, or I know well enough to know what their ticks are, what they like, what they
Great.
dislike, how things are
Yeah,
going.
awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you illuminating that because I think it's a big part of the equation. And as a business scales and grows to the size of CSP and bigger in some cases, excuse me, that it's gets a harder and harder thing to do, especially if you continue down the individualized program route, which I know you all are committed to. So thank you for sharing. I think those are really great tips, great ideas. I'm going to pull up there. I think we can keep talking on these topics for at least another 10 hours, but you really shared so much value already. So thank you again so much for your time, John. For our listeners who want to find more about you and follow you online or more about CSP, where can they find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Michael, I appreciate you having me, and hopefully people got something out of this. My Instagram and Twitter are at O'Neill Strength. It's not called Twitter anymore, is it? It's X. My Instagram and my
Yeah, for
X.
now. I don't know. It's the stupidest thing, but go ahead. Yeah.
Those are at O'Neill Strength. I also technically oversee the at CSP Mass. That's CSP MASS Instagram. I'm not the best on social media. I definitely wouldn't like if your continuing education is from my Instagram. It's pretty limited. I'll put it that way. But people could definitely reach me from there. I enjoy talking shop with people and answering questions people
Awesome.
have. Um, but yeah, so that's the best
That's
way to
awesome.
find me.
So,
Put it
listeners,
that
if you
way.
have any questions from today's episode you want to direct to John, go find him on the social media and follow CSP Mass because there is great content there and you can see what it looks like to do all the things he just talked about every day. Thanks so much, John. I really hope you have a great rest of your day. And dear listeners, if you love this podcast, leave us a 5-star review everywhere where you listen. Have a good one, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, Michael.